Today's scripture reading is from Genesis 22, verses 1 through 19. I'll be reading from the New King James. Please follow along in your translation. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Take now your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey, the lad, and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the 2 of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. Then he said, Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. So the 2 of them went together. Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of this place, The Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, In the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they rose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt at Beersheba.
Good morning. If you want to keep your Bible open to Genesis chapter 22, we're not going to be talking about this whole text today. We're probably going to spend at least a couple weeks, maybe 3. I haven't decided what we'll do next on this, but we'll be here for a little bit of time because I want to break it into some different sections that I think are useful for us to learn some things about how we relate with God, and especially in this story, the key, as you can see, the title, we're going to focus on chapter 22 and verses 1 and 2, the idea of God testing his people. That's the key. That's the word that we're following through so many of these different verses this morning. Before we get started, thank you for being with us. I know that there are quite a few visitors, and I think that I have said hello to most of you and caught you this morning, but if I missed you, I'm sorry about that. I'm glad that you're here. Some of you who are traveling, thank you for coming and stopping with us. And those of you who are local to the area, thank you also for coming and worshiping with us today. We appreciate it. As always, the thing that we're trying to do here is serve God. Open up his Bible, see what he said, and do it to the best of our ability. If you have any questions about anything that you see, you are more than welcome to ask that. I'm an open book. Most of our congregation here is an open book. Just ask. any questions that you have. We're happy to answer those for you. Let's jump into this. I'm going to focus on the idea in chapter 22 and verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham. In fact, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go ahead and throw the next couple of verses up. I'm going to read all of these. And as always, I will get chastised by the wife of my youth whenever we're done, and she says, "Why do you have to read all of the passages?" And there's a different reason today, because normally the answer is because, at least in my opinion, the answer is in how many times God says it. That's not the reason why I'm reading all of these passages today. Today, the reason why we're going to go through these different examples of God testing all of these different people is because I don't like this subject. That's the bottom line for it. I read Genesis chapter 22 and what God says to Abraham to sacrifice his only son, Isaac, and we read throughout this story that the whole thing was a test to see that if he would pass the test. And I don't like that. I don't like the way that it sounds, and I don't like the way that it feels. And so my natural inclination is to maybe just burn on past this one and go find another passage. But the thing is that the top two that we're going to look at there, with Solomon and with Daniel and his friends, those two examples are examples of just the word testing, where we're going to say, okay, what does it mean to test somebody? But then the last one is there 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the last 5, and those are not the only ones in the Bible. They're just the clearest and the easiest to use for illustration purposes. The last 5 that we're going to look at are specific examples of this language, God testing another person or another group of people to see how they're going to respond, to see what they're going to do. And I think the main point, at least one of my 2 main points at the end of this lesson is going to be for me when I stand up here and say, I don't like this subject. I don't like the way that it sounds, and I don't like the way that it feels. We're going to see all of these examples, and the solution is, too bad, Ryan. This is what God said. There's more than enough examples to get the idea of what's going on here, and so maybe I'll have some more to say about that in just a little bit. Let's start with 1 Kings chapter 10. As I said just a minute ago, this is nothing more, in 1 Kings chapter 10, this is nothing more than an example of this word testing being used and how we might apply it to what we see with God. Let's start in verse 1. We're going to read, I don't know, we'll see if I stick with it. I want to read all the way down to verse 7. I don't think we need to get the point, but probably we will anyway. Now when the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. So I could stop right there and say that's it. But here's the thing. When you keep on reading, you get to see, we're going to fill out the nature of what it means for her to test Solomon and what that looks like and what some of the things were that she was doing. Verse 2, she came to Jerusalem with a very great retinue, with camels bearing spices, very much gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she told him all that was on her mind, and Solomon answered all her questions. And there was nothing hidden from the king that he could not explain to her. And when the queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food of his table, the seating of his officials, and the attendance of his servants, their clothing, his cupbearers, his burnt offerings that he offered at the house of the Lord, there was no more breath in her. And she said to the king, the report was true that I heard in my own land of your words and of your wisdom. But I did not believe the reports until I came, and my own eyes have seen it, and behold, the half of it was not told to me. Your wisdom and prosperity surpass the report that I have heard. So you see what's going on here with testing? She heard something about Solomon, and her mind was, I need to see it for myself. And the testing, well, she even says it. The testing was, I'm not sure that I believe you. I've heard about your wisdom. I've heard about your prosperity. Everybody's talking about it. But I need to come and see it for myself to see if it's real and if it actually is true. That's the way that the word testing is used in a not God example. I'm not going to go over to Daniel chapter 1, but in verse 8 and down in verses 12 through 15, this is where Daniel and his 3 friends won't eat the king's food and drink the king's wine. And they say, let us do this instead. Let's have vegetables and water. And I'm not sure if the idea there is like a Hebrew ceremonial cleanness thing. We don't want to be unclean with your food, or maybe it's just a matter of we're in captivity and we don't think it's for us to enjoy all of this prosperity while our family and friends are out there suffering. I don't know exactly what their motivation was, but anyway, they said, let us have water and vegetables and not all of the good, prosperous foods that the most powerful, wealthiest man in the world at the time gives to us. And the person, the attendant who was in charge of them said, let's do this. Let's run a test first. That's where the word's used in this story. I'll let you have a short period of time to only have what you want to do, and we'll test it. And the idea is, let's see. Let's see if what you say really is going to work and if this thing pans out to be true. And so that's going to kind of be my theme as I go through the next 5 passages where God tests different people. Most of the time he's testing Israel as a nation. The thing that I'm associating with the word test is, let's see. Let's see if it's real. Let's see if it's true. I'm going to put you to the test and we're going to find out. Okay, so jump down to Exodus chapter 15. This is the very first one. And as always when we do something like this, I'm going to apologize. I'm not going to read the entire context. You can read that on your own, but I'm just going to jump around and make the point here. Exodus chapter 15 and verses 22 through 26. Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea. They went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. That's the problem. And, when I talk about Israel and we give these examples, my normal manner is to give Israel a hard time. They are a rebellious and sinful group of people. They have a lack of faith over and over again. But put yourself in their shoes. They've just left their home, even how bad their home was. They left their home, they're wandering around in desert wilderness, and they don't have any water. This is not an easy situation for this group of people. Now, we can look backwards and say, how can you not have faith? Look at everything that happened. But what would you do if you were wandering in the desert wilderness and you didn't have any water? Because my guess is you probably wouldn't fare very much better than Israel did. I know that I probably wouldn't. So here we go. We don't have any water. Verse 23. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter, therefore it was named Marah. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? And he cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log, and he threw it in the water, and the water became sweet. There the Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and here it is. There he tested them. You see this whole situation? There God tested the people, saying, if you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God, and do that which is right in his eyes, and give ear to his commandments to keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer. Dave, that's your comment from class. That's the one I was thinking about. Your comment was the difference between death and obedience at the same time, or prosperity and, what appears to be life. This is hard times. God says, there's no question, we don't have to wonder about what's happening in this text. Here is Israel in the desert wilderness with no water, and God says, I'm testing you. This is a test to see if, even in the face of what I would probably call impossible circumstances, will you still trust me and obey me? I highlighted it in my Bible. I don't know if you need to do the same thing to see it and to remember it, but the words in verse 25, this is a statute and a rule, and there he tested them. That's an example of what we're talking about today. Chapter 16 and verse 4, we're going to do the same thing with food. The Lord said to Moses, behold, I'm about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, listen, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. And you know the story. God said, this is what I want you to do on Friday before the Sabbath. I want you to go out and pick up 2 days worth of food so that you don't have to work and get food on Saturday, on the Sabbath. And the people did not believe him in this situation. They went out and they had to find out the hard way. But what I'm interested in for this lesson is that God said, here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to do it, how we're going to do it. And he says the words, I want to see. Remember those key phrases? I want to see if your faith is real and true. Will you listen to me and obey me and do the things that I said? Or are you just going to do it your own way and do whatever you feel like doing? But here is another one of these examples of God testing the people. Turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 8. The Exodus started, the wandering started with no water and no food, but God provided water and food for the people. And in both of those situations, it was, I'm testing you to see if you're going to do what I said. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, though, it turns out this entire wandering period was a big 40-year test to see if Israel was what they claimed to be, if they really did have the faith in God that he called on them to trust and to throw themselves entirely at him for provision and for mercy. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 1. The whole commandment that I command you today, you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land that the Lord swore to give to your fathers. And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you, there's our word, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you, and he let you hunger and fed you with manna, and manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. This whole time, God led the people in the wilderness, and on more than one occasion, they thirsted because they didn't have water. And on more than one occasion, at the very start anyway, they were hungry, but God provided their daily bread. It's not that they could store up, it was daily bread. And what he was teaching his people was, you have got to constantly trust me. You have to believe me and trust me that tomorrow there's going to be food for you. And he says, from our perspective, I don't know if Israel knew this at the time. I mean, I guess Moses told them back in Exodus 15 and 16, but I don't know how much Israel knew at the time, but we know with the benefit of hindsight that the whole thing was a test. Are you who you claim to be? Are you the thing that you really need to be? And the concept of test from these first two passages are God saying, I want to see it. I want to see it. Prove it to me. Let's see your faith. Deuteronomy 13 and verses 1 through 3. Starting in verse 1, if a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises among you and gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or wonder that he tells you comes to pass, and if he says, let us go after other gods which you have not known, and let us serve them. If a prophet comes to Israel, and that prophet says, hey everybody, I'm a prophet, let's go serve other gods. If that thing happens, in verse 3, you shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. There it is. It's the exact same story. And look, we got one more, but there's even more. in the Bible than this. But here is a situation. I think I don't like Genesis 22 the most, but this is probably my second one. I don't know. The food and water is a big one too. But here's another one where here comes a false prophet. And the false prophet is out there saying, hey, everybody, let's do something that's wrong. And God is standing back saying, I wonder if they're going to follow me. We're going to find out. Let's see. Let's see if they're going to stick with me and with my word, or if they're going to walk off the trail and do their own thing however they want to do it. We're going to find out. You see how I'm connecting in all of these examples, the two words, let's see, let's find out. That's what testing is. Last one, Judges chapter 2. Probably this is enough, but this is the last good one. So Judges chapter 2, verse 19, and we'll split this up, probably. Judges chapter 2, verse 19, whenever the judge died, Israel turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers. That's why I say to the judges, the book of Judges is not a judge's cycle, it's a downward spiral. They were getting worse and worse and worse. They were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them, bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. Chapter 3 and verse 1. Now these are the nations that the Lord left, here it is, to test Israel by them. That is, all in Israel who had not experienced the wars in Canaan. So God says, we got to test the Exodus generation and find out that they were not who they were supposed to be. But I left these nations in the land because you are going to experience a lot of the same stuff, and we're going to find out if you're any better. And we already saw in chapter 2 and verse 19 that they weren't. They just kept failing and failing and failing. In verse 4, chapter 3 and verse 4, all of these things. They were for testing Israel to know whether Israel would obey the commandments of the Lord which he commanded their fathers by the hand of Moses. And so you read the book of Judges, which is mostly an account of Israel getting F's on their report card. God tested them. Will my people follow me? And the answer that we see throughout the book is no, they will not. This is just from a commentary. I'm not going to throw it up on the board, but I thought it was useful. Testing shows what someone is really like, and it generally involves difficulty or hardship. Here's some stuff about Abraham. I'm not going to read all of these different passages. You can go ahead and turn back to Genesis chapter 22 if you would like. But over the last couple of weeks, I've not been good to Abraham. We've read all of these different stories, even though he's one of these great heroes of faith, and he's done, the New Testament especially. That's not true. The Old Testament, probably especially, more than the New Testament, really paints the picture of Abraham as the father of God's people, this great man who did great things. And we've gone through Genesis and we've been looking at all of these different stories, and Abraham has really dropped the ball a lot. He's made a lot of mistakes. But here's the thing. This is my but. I've given Abraham an awfully hard time over the last several weeks. But here's the thing. This guy had faith. Whatever else you might say about him, and wherever you see him stumbling and tripping and not having the kind of faith that he should have had, look at all of these examples that we have seen. In Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1, God said, go from your country. And then in verse 4, and he went. How many of us would do that? God comes and says, hey, go. Leave all of your people, everything that you know, walk away from it and go there. And you say, okay. And you're just going to do it. But Abraham did. In chapter 15, in verses 1 through 6, there was this question. God, I'm old and my wife is old. How are we going to have a son? And you're going to fulfill all these promises. And God said, you are. And then in verse 6, one of the most famous verses in all of the Bible, and Abraham believed God, and God reckoned that belief to him as righteousness. That's the thing. That's the thing that Paul quotes in Romans that is the basis of our salvation, that Abraham said, okay, I believe you. chapter 17 and verses 22 and 23, I don't care who you are, this is a big one. God said to an adult grown man who is the head of a lot of servants and a big family at this point, well, family in the sense of his servants and everything that belongs to him, Abraham, I want you and everybody that you are responsible for to be circumcised. And I hate the way this looks. I hate that day is down on the next line. I tried, resized it, it was too small. I tried to do everything. I could have just said circumcised because it's a bullet point, right? But I left it because it's not just that Abraham did the thing that God told him to do. It says that very day. Abraham, I want you to go out and do this thing. And he said, all right, we're going to do it right now. How many of you would do that? How many of us? Abraham, this is what I want you to do. And you're like, okay, right now, without delay. This is some faith. Like he did what he was told to do. The Genesis 21 story that we talked about 2 Sundays ago, I think, where God told Abraham to send out Hagar and Ishmael. And we made a big point about this on Sunday night, that I think Abraham was in the mindset that Ishmael was going to be the son, his son of promise, who was going to inherit everything. And God said, no, you need to send him away. And he did it. And he got up early in the morning to send him out. That's the same thing as saying that very day. It was important to him, and without delay, he was going to do what God told him to do. And so that brings us to Genesis 22 and verse 3. You see the language again. God tested Abraham and said, take your son and offer him as a burnt offering. Verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning, and he's going to do the thing that he said. Read verses 10 and 11, just so you can feel like, man, this guy did it. He was serious. Then Abraham reached out his hand, took the knife to slaughter his son, but the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. Every commentary that I read on this said, there's a point in the angel calling out twice, Abraham, Abraham, like he was really going to do it. He got up early in the morning. He got all of his stuff together. The knife was in his hand, and the angel had to physically stop him from going through to do the thing that God told him to do. And so here is the picture, I think, that we're going to start at least some of our application with as we talk about this. God tested Abraham, and Abraham passed the test. So our takeaway is, would you or will you? When your turn for testing comes, and that's the part that I start to not like this conversation. There are occasions, we'll read about a couple of them here in just a minute. There are occasions in our life where, at least with the benefit of hindsight, we can know that God was testing us to know if we are what we claim to be. And he's saying, I want to see if it's real. I want to see if it's true. And the thing about a test, all of us can say that we have faith. But you don't get to know that you have faith until you actually are really tested. Like, that's when faith becomes faith. It's not faith when we're sitting here all having a good time, taking it easy, saying, I have faith. Do you really have faith? Because you get to find out when you walk through the fire. There are two things. Oh, I like this a lot. Let me read this one. Although the commandment was to sacrifice Isaac as an offering to the Lord, the real point of the act was Abraham's sacrifice of himself. It's not that Abraham is sacrificing Isaac. It's that Abraham is saying, I don't like this and I sure don't want to do it, but I'm going to do what you tell me to do. Abraham was sacrificing himself, that is, his will and his wisdom to regard his son Isaac. And so number one, we ask, is my faith real? And we find out in the hard times. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verses 6 and 7, in this you rejoice. Excuse me. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, You have been grieved by various trials. Has that ever happened? That's where you say, okay, have you? Have you ever been grieved by various trials in life? And so this is what we say about that. So that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so you go through the hard times where it's no longer us sitting in a good circumstance, all enjoying life, and everything's cruising along smooth and easy. These difficult, various trials pop up, and God says, we're going to test the genuineness of that faith. Is it real? And so this is where I would invite you. I can't stand up here and give examples of this because they're going to be different examples for all of us. The last time you were tested, did you pass? It's an easy enough thing to think about. When was the last trial that you endured and walked through? And you look backwards and you think about it and you said, okay, did I walk with faith through that trial like Abraham? Did I pass the test? In Hebrews 11, I think we have to read this. I almost knocked this passage out, but it's a picture of this by faith. Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. That's Abraham's mindset. God says, hey, Abraham, you waited all these years for this son, and I finally gave him to you. Now go and sacrifice him. And Abraham goes, okay. I mean, can you imagine? I don't have any idea what's going on. And Abraham's mindset is, I guess God's just going to have to bring him back to life. But I believe that he can or will get me through this situation. And so he's going through with it. And my takeaway has got to be, is my faith going to pass the test? Is it real? Is your faith going to pass the test? Because it will be tested. That's why we read all of those passages. There's enough examples throughout the Bible to know with certainty that you will be tested, at least through various trials. And is your faith going to pass when your time comes? Number two, we can answer this question: am I serving God or myself? The test of obedience for the Christian would not differ essentially. Now, God's probably not going to say to Ryan, all right, Ryan, pick up a knife and sacrifice your son. But his word to me is essentially no different than that to Abraham. The Lord calls me, the Lord calls us to obey his instructions, including sacrificing yourself and your possessions to him in fear and devotion. And so I'll give you two examples of this. In Matthew chapter 4, while Jesus was walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who was called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. Immediately, they left their nets and followed him. And the next couple of verses are about James and John doing the exact same thing. And that's the thing. God says, hey, Eric, follow me. And what's your response? Like, here we read through the Bible. This is what God said. What's your response? And you read all of these examples. There's only one right answer, and that is, okay. Here I go. That's why we read these passages. On that very day, early in the morning, okay, God, you said it. I'm about it. Let's do this thing. Here's another example. This is an example of somebody who said he was ready to follow God, but it turns out he wasn't. A ruler asked Jesus, teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus tells him, do this stuff, observe the law. In verse 21, he says, okay, I did it from the time I was a kid. And Jesus heard, and he said to him, one thing you still lack. Sell all that you have and distribute it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. If this was Abraham or James or John or Peter or Andrew, when Jesus said, do this thing, they would have said, all right. And they would have done it. But look at what the text says. It says that this guy, when he heard these things, became very sad, for he was extremely rich. And you know what that means. He was ready to come to Jesus on his own terms. Okay, Jesus, I followed all these laws. I'm ready to come to you. And Jesus, I don't know how this works. I just assume this is how it works. Jesus looks into this man's heart, and he knows. And he says, let's see. It was a test. Let's see if you really are what you say you are. Sell everything. He's a rich guy. We call this the rich young ruler. Sell everything that you have. And he failed the test. And it says he went away sad. And I imagine that Jesus was sad too. If anyone is inclined to be a true worshiper of the Lord, it will involve the willingness to sacrifice whatever is dearest and most treasured, even if such should be considered a gift from God. So, you say that you have faith. Is it real? And will you pass the test? That's where we say, gird up your loins and be ready for the test when it comes. And let's find out. We're going to see. Okay, the last thing, and then we'll be done. Abraham passed. Verse 12, Genesis chapter 22 and verse 12. The angel says, Abraham, Abraham. And he says, here I am. And he said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. These words are highlighted in my Bible. For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Now I know you passed the test because I saw that you really are what you claim to be. This is why James talks about this passage in connection with the faith that we all should have. Do you want to be shown, O foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? You can say that you have faith all day long, but if you're not living it and walking it and doing it, saying that you have faith is worthless. That's useless. That's what he says. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. You know what that is? The scripture was fulfilled that said Abraham believed God and it was counted to righteousness. Genesis 22 is God saying, and I saw it. I saw that it was real. That you really do. And Abraham is called a friend of God. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. So, there you go. Are you ready for the test? I have this, I haven't had it in a while. It's like a recurring nightmare from mostly when I was a student. Mostly and later when I was a student, things were harder. And I cared more, so I tried. But I would have this dream where I showed up to class one day, and I sat down and I had all of my stuff, and the teacher said, all right, time to take the final. And in my dream, I thought, I didn't know that today was the final. It's time for a test, and I haven't studied, and I don't know any of my stuff, and I'm not ready for this. And here's the thing about that nightmare. You know the test is coming. You know you're going to be tested. And so here's the practical takeaway for the rest of the day today, for all of next week. Get yourself ready to find out if you're going to pass the test, if your faith is real and true, and if you really are what you claim to be, if we really are what we claim to be. If you sit here and you say that you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, but you have not done anything about it yet, guess what? It's time to do something so that God can say, now I know. I see that you really are one of my people. You come forward, you repent of your sin and say, I'm turning away. My life is going to be a reflection of my faith. I'm going to turn away from the sin that separated me from God in the first place. And here it is. I so believe and put myself in God's hands that I am going to kill this old dead man and do with this old dead man what we do with all dead things. I'm going to bury him in the grave in the waters of baptism, so that when you're raised from the dead, as Jesus was raised from the dead, now you walk in faith and newness of life. If we can help you with that today, come forward and let us know as we stand and sing the invitation song.